from last year? From last year, what do you want to hang on to and what do you want to let go of? But you don't have to if you don't want to.
No, I don't think we will for this because we're starting late.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, welcome to the Inland Valley Storytellers monthly story swap session. I'm John St. Clair, the leader of the group and your Zoom host. I live in Ontario, and we're going to go around and have people who are here in person introduce themselves, and then we'll have the Zoom people introduce themselves.
I'm Ina Haugen. I'm here as a listener, and I live in Claremont.
I'm Chris St. Clair, and I'm here as a listener, although sometimes I've told tales.
One time.
I am Glenn Grant. I live here in Claremont, and I will be sharing a story tonight.
Hi, I'm Cecilia Hibbert. I'm also from Ontario. I'm a listener here. I'm a Glance +1 today.
Hi, I'm Ron Schick. I live in Riverside. I'm a storyteller, and I have a tale to tell tonight. Listen, need to call it the city.
Thank you. And now we will, let's see, I'm going to remove the spotlight from here and Jane, you're up.
Hi, I'm Jane. I live in Ontario and I wish I could be there. I'll see you next time.
Okay. Thank you. Move the spotlight off of her. Whoops, that didn't work. Try again. Oh, you moved. The picture's moved.
I don't feel like we moved.
Yeah, no, you did.
I'm Nora Quinn. I live in Claremont. Years ago, I came to a couple of these meetings and then my life interfered, and I'm back.
Well, welcome back.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just got an email from Adrian Lowry. I'm gonna check that. Let's see. What did she say? So sorry, I won't be able to make it tonight. Okay. All right. So, who wants to tell a story first? I want to go last.
I never like going first. That leaves Ron.
Okay, so we're going to move this around, and Ron can stand up there. You stand right about here, you'll be in the picture.
Check a picture. Last time we had pictures.
Yeah.
How's that?
There he is.
On the 17th of this month, I'm going to tell this story at the genre storytelling event. Hey, this will be my...
You have to project more for the computer.
Talk louder.
Talk louder? Okay.
Yes, please.
Anyway, I'm going to do this at that point. I have this tale in several years.
What was so you were saying it was January 17th. What is it?
January 17th, at 6, I think.
No, I think it's at 7.
It's at 7. The Storyteller Association of California, SAC, will have its genre storytelling event, and I am performing this story at that event. And it's all by Zoom.
It's a once a month thing, and every month is a different theme, a different genre.
Oh.
From all over California.
Oh, nice.
Sometimes people from further away. Here you go. I grew up in Riverside. For 11 of my childhood years, we lived on a piece of land that had 144 different fruit trees. Literally 13 kinds of plum, as an example. Wow. So most of my time on weekends, there was always something that had to be done in Florida. It just was. From late April through late July, sometimes the first week of August, everything was about fruit. And finally, the last of the peaches were off the trees, and we would head to Texas. My mother would drive station wagon with a big holder thing for all of our gear, all the rest of the top, and a mattress for us kids in the back. And the three of us would ride along, and she would drive to Texas. Lots of fun. Some underestimated the car. We would get to Texas. We would visit my chick grandmother. Sometimes my grandfather was there, but he was mostly on the road with salesmen. And then we'd go to Austin and visit my grandparents. And then finally we'd go out to Uncle Tony's ranch in Lockhart, Texas. The ranch has been in the family for generations. Some of my ancestors had fought in the Mexican-American War, and they did war for independence, and yeah, the whole thing. Lots of things we did there were a lot of fun. A lot of fun. We could ride the burro. It was a very patient beast, and we rode it a lot. We could, of course, play King of the Mountain. We could, of course, throw rocks. We could do all sorts of things that I found fun, but there's one thing that happened often that I hated. You see, you may not know it. Lots of people don't. But fish know who the fisher people are. Using the exact same bait and the exact same kind of reel and the exact same kind of boat, my brothers and my cousins would pull out fish after fish after fish, whether it were up in the pond or down in the Onion Creek. And I would catch nothing. So one morning, they said, let's go up to the pond and fish today. And I said, I think we'll stay here. They looked at me strangely. They grabbed their gear and ran. I didn't know what to do with myself. Adults didn't have any time for me. Went out to the barn and noticed a crowbar. And I thought, I'm going to get that rock down. There was one of those scrags of land in central Texas where a bit of mountain sticks up to the grassy hills below. And we had been playing King of the Mountain on it and throwing things and playing on that all summer long. And it seemed to us that a stone near the top was ready to break off of the bowl. And I decided I'm going to knock that stone down today. So I went up to the top and I pounded a little, tried a little, threw some rocks at it. Wandered around a bit, went back to it. Late in the afternoon, though, I went try one more time and there was a crack. And then the stone rolled. And it went kabang, kaboom, 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 down to the foot of the hill. And I thought, oh, wow. I left the crowbar right there. I wanted to see what I'd gotten to. And I went to see where my stone had gotten to. I could see the path it had made through the weeds and the grass. I got up close to it, though, and nobody that's ever been in Central Texas doesn't know what that sound is. Yet you still stand stock still and you find that snake. When I spotted the snake, though, it was half under the rock I had knocked down. It looked so pitiful. I didn't want to kill nothing. I got my foot up to the far side of the stone from it, and I pushed it, and I turned, and I ran. Wasn't very old at the time, wasn't very fast. I looked back behind me, and here came that rattler. Oh, I was scared to death. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. That snake got closer and closer and closer. I was maybe 50 yards from the ranch house, and it came up right beside me, and I stopped and froze. And so my waistguard around my neck and rubbed this little cheek against mine. From that moment on, Hiss was my best friend. Hiss and I would play. We had wonderful times. I'd roll a golf ball across floor, and he'd go and he'd get it, bring it back to me. And he would let you whirl him around like a hula hoop and toss him in the air, and he'd never let you miss. He did have a couple of problems, but you know, that's the nature of things. There was a family up the road that had no use for these California kids. And one of them came riding up on his bike one day when Hiss and I were out rolling a ball around, and he came up on the porch, and I know he had done or said something mean. Just took one look at him, coiled up, and went, you never saw it. He took off. Never had another problem with him. Just had two really bad habits, though. One, he often wanted to go out on his snaky business when there was nobody handy to push the screen door out for him. So he'd take a hold of it with his things and he'd push his way forward, he'd slide under and get out. That did create some interesting problems, but his other bad habit is that he loved to wait up by the road and hope that a vehicle would come by. Didn't have any traffic, might go hours without it, but if somebody was going slow enough, he'd slide out, put his teeth into the tire, and make himself go loop and go down the road. I begged him not to do this terrible, dangerous thing, but either he didn't understand or he's just too stubborn. I don't know. Now, the problem with him opening up that door that way is that, well, you know what happens when something's bit with a rattlesnake? It swelled up. The bottom of that door got bigger and bigger and bigger until finally it would stop and you couldn't quite close the door. And Uncle Tony said, you know, this is your responsibility. You need to help take care of this. He took down the screen door, took it out to the barn and said, this is what I want you to do. I want you to spread this turpentine on that door. I want you to spread it over and over and over again, and then we'll cut a little off, and it'll all work out. Well, I did as he told. It was sort of a punishment, I guess. I don't know. But I kept at it, and after a long while, he came by, and he took a soft thingy bobber and he said, that should do it. He put the door back on the hinge, and he said, I'm not sure. You can go out anytime you want to. We mostly got along. Days went by. Only had a few weeks for it. We'd have to leave to go back to school. And one afternoon, I was sitting inside. We were playing Monopoly when we heard a truck go by and here's some brakes. And I rushed outside. I was afraid of what I was going to see. And that's where it was. I went out into the road and I could see Hiss lying there. He was lying there flat as a pancake. My best friend in the world was just lying there like that.
When you said I've got a tale tonight, you always tell folk tales. Where did you come up with that?
Well, guess what the genre is this month?
That I'm supposed to be following?
No, that
for his
he's
thing.
going to
Okay.
do on January 17th.
I'm way off the reservation. As
The
you.
genre is tall tales.
And all the opening of that story is slightly longer version talks about the one time I caught fish. I didn't catch fish for fishing. There was a brand new development. Went the northern route to go to my grandmother Chick's place first. So we passed through there, go through Grand Canyon. And there's a new place called Oak Creek Canyon, just opened to the public that summer. And so my mother, always being interested in anything new, pulled us in. They had a Native American in full regalia there talking about the people who had lived in the Great Swamp before the white man, their culture and their ideas. And you know, my brother being my brother said, well, can we fish in this creek? And he said, no, we don't allow hooking lines anywhere near here, but you can catch a fish if you work at it. And we asked him how. He said, well, put on your bathing suits. I'll see you at the river. And there were several other kids, of course, this around. He took us out into the river and he taught us how to tickle fish. You find a large rock, in the middle of the stream. Not a tall tale, it actually happened. Anyway, and you put your hands down and wait, and fish will come along and they'll nibble a little at your finger just because they think there might be food there. And if you're patient enough, okay, and you're still enough, you can grab that fish and throw it up on the bank. Well, my brothers didn't have the patience. None of the other kids that were trying this had the patience, but there was one thing I was really good at. It was at daydreaming and sitting still. I did it most of my childhood. I learned to read several years later. I pulled out a fish. And I pulled out another. Of course, my brothers didn't have any to solve that fish. That's the only day in my life when I was a successful fisherman.
So I have a question for you, Ron.
Yes.
You went to the Timpanogos story. Did you hear Myra, or is it Mara Mensis tell the story about the fisherman with the three brothers?
No, I'm not missed it.
And the youngest brother never caught any fish, and the two older brothers always caught fish. Oh, it was a great story. It was a folktale from Kenya.
Huh. Anyway, that's my tall tale that I'll share on the 17th by Zoom.
Will that be recorded?
Yes.
Because that's a classic. I'm gonna go back every year and listen to this tape.
Well, it's recorded tonight, and it'll be recorded on the 17th as well.
Did you hit the record button?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it also will be recorded on the 17th at the genre.
In all the years I've been coming here, I've never heard it fail. It's always been fun. Yeah. It's serious. What a treat. Not just like I've been lying to you.
Okay.
Well done.
Will you be next, Glenn? Okay. Turn this around so Glenn will be the next person. Come on up and make sure you're in the screen.
The next contestant. So, as per usual, one must have his music. Am I in the screen? I am. So tonight I'm going to tell a true story, autobiographical. And the inspiration for the story, as most of my autobiographical true stories are, is the theme that we can accomplish anything regardless of our past, that we can survive anything and we can create a future. There's a poem called Still I Rise. I know we don't have the time this evening for me to illuminate the whole thing, but there's a passage from Still I Rise that resonates with me. And the poet says, leaving behind nights of terror and fear, into a daybreak that is wondrously clear, still I rise. And that really was the inspiration for me tonight, to tell a story of a young girl. The year was 1928, and she was born to Bailey Johnson. Bailey was a U.S. Navy man. And it was St. Louis, Missouri, where she was born. Of course, 1928 was the Great Depression, the start of it. Millions of Americans in our country faced devastating poverty, unemployment. Millions of people were wondering where their next meal would come from, and despair had washed over our country. Growing up, the young girl was very shy and introverted, very reflective. The years in St. Louis were difficult for her. 5 or 6 years had gone by until one day, her mother and her father loaded her onto a train by herself, and her journey would take her to Stamps, Arkansas, a small town of Stamps, Arkansas. It would be there that she would be reunited with her grandmother. And the ironic thing about her grandmother was that she had what many small towns have, and it was a general store. And in these general stores, you know, back in those days, it's where you could find the basics of life, the basic things you needed to survive. And ironically enough, the grandmother, instinctively enough, had a thriving store during this Great Depression. Oftentimes, you would find the young girl sitting reflectively with her grandmother in that store. 6, 7, 8 years old, too young to work, but just watching people dealing with the Great Depression, dealing with the challenges of just gathering basic necessities. It provided the grandmother a way to shepherd her way and her family through the Great Depression. The young girl, within a few years, reached the age of 8. Suddenly, one day, her father appeared, came back into town, into Stamps, Arkansas, loaded the young girl on a train. Perfect timing. And that train's journey would take the young girl, again, alone and by herself, back to be reunited with her mother in St. Louis, Missouri. Life with her mother was difficult. The Great Depression had washed over all of America, and it made it for a life of despair and hopelessness. And living with her mother was not easy. By this time, the family had divorced. The mother was a nurse, but she struggled in that Depression era. A few years would go by, and one day on a warm summer night in June, the young girl had been with a family friend. And suddenly, out of nowhere, she was attacked. And sadly, she was abused, terribly and tragically abused. This was a vicious abuse. And the girl, of course, fortunately had spoken up of this. And within a day or two, the man had been arrested. Ironically enough, 4 days would go by, and he was suddenly released from jail. True story. You see, in those days, when you spoke up about a crime and an abuse, back in St. Louis in Missouri, in the Midwest, during the Depression, sometimes people would take justice into their own hands. That justice was doled out. And once the young girl had spoken up, within several days of his release, he too would face his end. He was murdered by the family members. This so traumatized the young girl, for she felt when she went inward that her voice had the power to take life, that her voice could kill someone. And because of this, she chose not to speak for 5 years. Not one word did she speak for 5 years. But there's a positive light to this. Within the darkness, there's always light. And what came of this was her love of books. We are surrounded by books. Her love of poetry, her love of literature, from Charles Dickens to Edgar Allan Poe, and one of her favorites, William Shakespeare. And so she became an observer of life. She never spoke a word for those 5 years, but in observing life and delving into her love of literature. But one day, a family friend, a teacher, knowing of the girl's tragic story, challenged her and said, you know, if you're going to love poetry, you must learn to speak it. And this galvanized the young girl. This inspired her to finally start speaking. She would take one more pilgrimage back to Stamps, Arkansas, to be reunited with her grandmother on that train, so emblematic of her youth, those train rides. And she would spend the remainder of her youth in that general store with her grandmother. By this time, the Great Depression had washed through America, the start of World War II. The young girl's life became quite something. Her travels would take her out of Stamps, Arkansas. She would give birth as a teenager herself to another young life, She became a mother, but she would travel to far off places, to the Horns of Africa and Ghana. She would travel to San Francisco in her 20s. She became one of the first women in San Francisco to, you guessed it, conduct a train. Her travels would take her on to Europe, even into Los Angeles. As she embarked and sailed into the 60s, it was Watts and the riots. She experienced those. She even met Malcolm X and became friends with him before his assassination, until she landed on the most seminal year of her life. That year was 1968. And in 1968, she took her love of poetry and her love of literature, and she put pen to paper. And she wrote the famous, "I know why the caged bird sings." From that, she gained international acclaim, notoriety, recognition, and she gave power to the poem, "Still I Rise," and those words, that passage I read to you early. I'll close the story when she says, "Leaving nights of terror and fear behind, to a day tomorrow that is glorious." And it's emblematic of her poem, "Still I Rise," when the famous poet and literist and author Maya Angelou reminds us all that from a devastating youth, no matter our circumstances, we can create an amazing future. She would go on, as all of you know Maya Angelou's story, she went on to have an amazing life of great notoriety, writer of many poems and books. I chose to share the story with you tonight as just a small example of a reminder that we can create anything. She writes, "Still I Rise." It inspires us to do the same in our life. That's the story of Maya Angelou.
That was great. Thank you. Now, I had said I want to be last. I don't know whether Jane's still with us. She said she was going to leave at 7:30 and come back.
Oh, there she is.
Yeah. Do you have a story tonight, Jane?
No, I don't. No, I have some noise coming in too, so I'm on mute.
Okay. I guess I'll be next, which is last. So I was hoping to have a news story, but life has been a little hectic around our house, and I didn't get a news story ready. But I thought I might tell an old story that, well, I don't think you've ever heard it, probably, because I could tell anything.
And you know hundreds of stories, so
No, actually-
always new for us.
Actually, I don't. And I don't know whether you've heard this one or not, Glenn. It would have been here. I guess I told it at the Folk Music Center a number of years ago. And it actually was the very first story I told at a celebration in 2003. And it's an English folk tale called Tops or Bottoms. And I've never recorded it before. So I'm going to take that opportunity. So as I said, it's an English folk tale. Long ago, there was a family farm that had been in the family for many, many generations. And the farmhouse was right in the middle of the farm. And it was surrounded by field that the farmer owned. And in the north field, the farmer grew wheat. In the east field, the farmer grew alfalfa to feed his horses and cows. In the south field, the farmer grew all kinds of cash crops plus crops for himself, like carrots and beets and peas and beans. But in the west field, the farmer didn't grow anything at all. And as far as he knew, nobody had ever grown anything in that west field. And he could remember when he was a kid, he asked about, well, why, he asked his dad, why aren't you planting anything in that field? And his father said, don't ever plant anything in that west field. You will not get anything from it. So the farmer listened to his father's advice and carried on. Even after his father died, he would not plant anything in that west field. But it bothered him. That field every year would grow native grasses that would die down and decompose into the soil. And he just knew that was going to be rich, fertile soil. And so one year, after he had plowed and sown the north field, the east field, and the south field, he went out to that west field and he looked at it and he said, you know what? I'm going to try planting something here. What have I got to lose? I'm not getting anything out of this land anyway. And so tomorrow I'm going to plow and sow this field. So early the next morning, he went out with a horse and plow. And just before he started, he announced to no one in particular, but to the whole world, I'm going to plow and sow this field. And as soon as that plow went into the ground, out of the ground came a mean, ugly goblin with green, bumpy skin and long yellow teeth. Fine, and I will take the crop, I will. Well, the farmer was startled by this goblin. And he thought to himself, no wonder no one ever planted anything here. It's haunted by a goblin. But still, he thought, maybe he could trick this. And the farmer said, well, if you want a crop, why don't you plant it yourself? Nah, too much work, said the goblin. Oh, said the farmer, well, how about if I plow and sow this field with a crop, and come harvest time, half for you, half for me. I don't know. And I'll do all the work, said the farmer. Goblin was thinking, half for you, half for me, you do all the work, fair enough. Great, said the farmer, which half do you want? Do you want the top half or the bottom half? Goblin thought, and then he dug his toe into that rich, fertile soil, and he thought of all the wonderful things that grow under the ground. He thought of potatoes, carrots, and beets. And he said, I'll take the bottoms. Fair enough, said the farmer. I get the tops, you get the bottoms. I'll be back at harvest time. And poof, the goblin disappeared in a puff of smoke. So the farmer proceeded to plow that field, and he sowed it with corn. And what a fine crop of corn it turned out to be. Well, come harvest time, farmer hitched up a wagon to his horse, and he went out, and he got out to the field, and the goblin appeared in a puff of smoke and said, I've come for my half of the crop. Fair enough, said the farmer. Remember, you wanted the bottoms, I'll take the tops. And so the farmer proceeded to take those golden ears of corn off the top and put it in his cart and left the useless roots and stubble for the goblin. Oh, that made that goblin mad, and he jumped up and down until poof, he disappeared in puffs. So the farmer proceeded to harvest all that corn and took a bunch of it to market to sell and dried some to have for his animals there on the farm, and he was very happy. Well, the next spring, the farmer plowed and sowed the north field, the east field, and the south field, and he went out again to that west field, and as soon as that plow went into the ground, poof, up came the goblin. You may have fooled me once, but you're not going to fool me again. This time, I take the top. Fair enough, said the farmer. You get the tops, I get the bottoms. I'll be back at harvest time. And so the farmer proceeded to plow and sow that field with carrots. And what a fine crop of carrots it turned out to be. And come harvest time, the farmer hitched up the cart to his horse. He went out to harvest, and poof, the goblin came. He said, I'm back for my half of the crop. And the farmer said, fair enough. You get the tops this time, I get the bottoms. So he pulled the carrots out of the ground, twisted the useless tops off, threw them to the goblin, and kept the golden carrots for himself. Oh, that made that goblin mad, and poof, he disappeared in a puff of smoke. Well, the next year in spring, after the farmer had plowed and sowed the north field and the east field and the south field, he went out to that west field again. And as soon as that plow went into the ground, poof, up came the goblin. You may have fooled me once. You may have fooled me twice, but you're not going to fool me again. This time, I choose the crop. Fair enough, said the farmer. And, said the goblin, I choose wheat. Fair enough, said the farmer. And, said the goblin, we are going to have a mowing contest at harvest time. We'll divide the field in half. You mow one half, I mow the other half, and whoever finishes their half first gets the whole crop. Now, the farmer didn't like this idea because he figured the goblin would not propose such a mowing contest unless he thought he could win. But he didn't feel like he was in a position to challenge this magical creature. And so he said, fair enough. I'll be back at harvest time. And poof, the goblin disappeared in the puff of smoke. So the farmer proceeded to plow and sow the field with wheat. And what a fine crop of wheat it turned out to be. But as it was growing, the farmer started to worry. And he thought, I better practice mowing. And so he went into the barn, he sharpened his sight, and he went out to that east field where the alfalfa was growing, and he was going to practice mowing the alfalfa, see if he could improve his technique. But with the first swipe, he hit a rock that was sticking up that he didn't see, and it put a dent in the blade. Drat, said the farmer, I got to go back and sharpen it. So he went back to the barn, and he was sharpening the scythe. As he was doing that, he got an idea. And he said, that's enough practice for today. He put the scythe back up on the wall. He got on his horse, and he rode into town. And he went to see the blacksmith. Now, the blacksmith was pounding a red-hot horseshoe into the correct shape when the farmer came in, and he said, what can I do for you, sir? And the farmer said, can you make me 100 long, thin iron rods? Why, sure, said the blacksmith, but what are you going to do with 100 thin iron rods? I think, said the farmer, I'm going to plant them. And so he did. So when it came to be harvest time, and the farmer went to the barn, hooked up his cart to the horse, and went out with his scythe to the field, the goblin was already there waiting for him, and the sun was just barely coming up. And he had a beautiful looking scythe, and he had a big smile on his toothy face. And the goblin said, are you ready for the mowing contest? The farmer said, yes, I am. So they each went to the edges of the field, and they started mowing towards the middle. And the farmer was going along, cutting down that wheat, and he stopped and he heard something from the other end of the field. It was the goblin. Drat, toughest wheat I've ever mowed in my life. Because you see, the farmer had indeed planted those rods. They were so thin you couldn't see them, planted them right next to the stalks of corn. And so that scythe, the goblin was strong and it was sharp. It was cutting through the iron rods, but it was rapidly becoming dull. And soon it wouldn't have been sharp enough to cut butter. Now, in those days, there was a custom that in a mowing contest, the two contestants could agree upon a time to stop and sharpen. And so the goblin called out, hey, farmer, when's sharpening time? Oh, about noon, I guess, said the farmer. Noon? I've lost already. He jumped up and down. He threw his scythe into the ground and poof, disappeared, never to be seen again. So the farmer proceeded to mow his side of the field. Then he went around to the goblin side of the field. He removed the remaining iron rods and he mowed that side of the field. And when he had finished, he said, fair enough. Tops or bottoms, an English motel. Yeah, had you heard that?
Never. I think it's great.
Okay.
No, I love that.
That was the very first story I ever performed in front of a paying audience. It was 2003 Celebration.
At Folk?
It was, no, back then, it was in the old Claremont Forum, which was in the old Courier building.
Oh,
It's
yeah,
now
yeah.
apartments.
Yeah, another Courier building.
The old Courier building next to the tracks.
Really?
That's where the Forum was before it moved to here.
Wow.
And we were there for about 7, 8 years before moving to this facility to have our monthly meetings.
Good sized celebration that year, total. Do you remember?
Maybe 15, 20 people.
Okay.
That was the very first celebration for the Inland Valley Storytellers.
Oh, okay.
And it was being, the leader of the group, R.V. Robinson,
Yeah, I remember already. Yeah.
she's the one that got the group going. And Chris started going before me and then got me to start going to the meetings. I told the story.
Were you a storyteller before 2002?
I'd never,
She went first.
yeah, she was the one into storytelling.
But what he's leaving out is that he was a debater,
Oh.
and his brother was a speech professor.
Oh, wow.
So he didn't come from nowhere.
Yeah, no, he did not.
My father required all 3 of the boys, not our sister, but all 3 of the boys had to take 2 classes, 2 electives in high school. One was speech, public speaking,
Oh, really?
because he thought that would teach us how to express ourselves. It was very important to be able to do this,
Right.
to speak in public.
Right.
And the second thing we had to take was drafting, because that would teach us to be neat.
Well, now you're a neat public speaker.
And my oldest brother did that, and he was in speech tournaments all through high school. I stopped kind of after my sophomore year because I got involved in sports, and that took up a lot of my time. But my brother then ended up getting a PhD in public rhetoric.
No way. I didn't even know that was possible.
Yeah, he got a PhD from UCLA in public rhetoric.
Is that,
He wrote his dissertation on right-wing radio broadcasts
is that,
in the early 60s.
oh my God.
And he ended up being a professor of public speaking, or whatever they called it, at Shippensburg State College in Pennsylvania for 40 years.
I've never even heard of that. That's very cool. That's very unique. So after coming to the first one, or the first few, did you get kind of whooped up and you
Yeah, it was
started-
fun. It was fun. And I started telling, I started with some children's literature, which was what this was, a
Yeah.
tale. But then I told a personal story about a peacock we had. And it's funny because R.V. Robinson thought I was going to tell that story for the celebration, but I wanted to do the tops or bottoms.
Yeah, no, I love the top spot. That's funny. Yeah, you did that well. Very nice.
Okay, I think I'm going to stop. Oh, Nick, you're here. Do you have a story? Nick is on the
I
street.
could tell you the story about why I was late, but because I forgot about the 7 o'clock start time change.
Oh.
But sure, I can do a story if you want.
Yeah, let me remove my spotlight. And put the spotlight on for you, and I'll turn the chair around so we can see.
This is a story that seems appropriate for a winter's night like this, because in Russia, they really understand what winter is like. And I ran across this story in 2 different versions many years ago and discovered that it had been collected by one of the 2 Russian folklorists who are the equivalent of the Brothers Grimm. And when it gets translated into English, I realized that they were making the name of one of the characters something that people in the Western English-speaking world would recognize, but it doesn't seem quite right. So I put it back to something closer to the original. Now, once, long ago, in the days of the czars, it was the whim of the czar as to who got to own land. Very rarely was land sold in those days. It was given as a gift or kept within families or very rarely traded. What was unusual about Russia was that the peasants who lived on the land were attached to the land. They were not allowed to move to other places if they were unhappy with the person who actually owned the land and mastered it. Now, as it happened, Taras was a kinder man than most. His family had been given land by the Tsar for service. Apparently, they were part of the winning army in one of the great wars that Russia had in the old days. And he raised his daughter to be kind, but her mother passed away. And when he remarried, unfortunately, the woman was more in love with the wealth that land brought than with Taras himself. Well, Taras's daughter, Alexandra, she was kind to the peasants, but her stepmother and her stepsister were not kind to her. And when Taras himself passed away of an illness, things took a turn for the worse. For you see, that meant that with 3 women there operating the farm, it was the stepmother who made the rules. And she worked the peasants as hard as she could without them dying of exhaustion. And nothing was ever good enough for her. There still wasn't enough money for the things that she wanted. And, well, she was stuck with Alexandra, who was obviously not as good as her own daughter, at least in her eyes. In truth, the stepdaughter was not, her stepsister was not really much of anything. She mostly lazed around the house, eating what she could and speaking her mind whenever she had an opinion. Well, for the first couple of years, Alexandra Tarasovna was able to accept this, but it was a hard winter in that 3rd year. They had prepared well for it, but the stepmother was still not happy. And finally, she told one of the peasants, the one who normally drove the carriage in the warm weather and the sleigh in the cold weather when there was snow on the ground. She told him, "We do not have enough food to feed all of us this winter. Therefore, I've decided that we can spare Alexandra. Take her into the forest in the sleigh and leave her there to freeze." And the peasant who had been a servant for the family said, "How could I do that? She's your own daughter. How could you do that?" "Well," said the stepmother, "I could kick your own family out of their homes this winter instead. That would leave us enough." And so the poor man was left with the choice of leaving a young woman to die or watching his own family share that same fate. He sneaked some warm robes into the sleigh when the stepmother wasn't looking, but he knew it might not be enough. And he took Alexandra out deep into the forest and said, "I'm terribly sorry. You were very dear to me, but so is my wife and so are my children, and I dare not risk their death in this cold." And Alexandra said, "That's all right. Do as you must." And he left her there with a blanket and a cloak that might help a little. Well, she sat down on a tree stump and was looking around at the forest. And as she looked up into the clear sky, for it was so cold that there were no clouds, she heard sounds almost like the ringing of tiny bells. And she thought for herself and thought, this is the sound of icicles. When you tap them, they make a little bit of a sound, and it sounds like that. And she looked around, and there, coming around a tree, was a man. Not young, but moving like a young man, not old, and yet giving an aura of being as old as everything. Well, he came around a tree closer to her and said, I am the king of winter, and I bring the cold. And Alexandra smiled, which was not what he expected. And she looked up at the sky and said, look how clear the sky is, and how the stars look like tiny points of ice up in that sky. Oh, isn't that beautiful? Well, he smiled a bit and danced around another tree, and as he did so, icicles began to hang down from its branches, and bits of ice touched the very limbs. I am the king of winter, and I bring ice. Oh, how beautiful you make those trees. With their leaves gone for the winter, I worry because, they might be self-conscious without their leaves. They would be just standing there, pieces of wood, but this makes them so beautiful. Well, the king of winter hadn't thought of it quite that way, but realized that she was appreciating what he was doing in decorating the forest with ice. A third time he approached her and said, I am the king of winter, and for you, I have a gift. Well, the next morning, the stepmother sent the peasant out in the sleigh to bring back her beloved stepdaughter, for at least she wasn't willing to begrudge her an inexpensive funeral. And when he came back in the sleigh, there was Alexandra in the sleigh next to him. But from a distance, it looked like she was covered in snow and ice crystals. And so the stepmother was very surprised when the sleigh pulled up and Alexandra hopped down out of the sleigh. And what had looked like ice crystals were jewels that she was wearing, all of white diamonds. And the snow was the white fur of the coat that she was wearing that had kept her warm the rest of the night. Well, how have you come by this great wealth? And how do you plan to share it with us? And Alexandra said, I got this gift from the king of winter. I was there in the forest and we talked, and this is what he gave me. Well, said the stepmother, I think I'll send my daughter out this evening. She deserves something like that. And so it was that that evening, the peasant was sent again to the forest with a young woman, this time the stepmother's daughter. And she was taken out into the forest and, frankly, was not very impressed with it. She wanted to be somewhere nice and warm instead of someplace cold and stupid looking, because she did not appreciate the cold or the winter or the ice. But she sat there because her mother had told her to, and told her that she would be rich when she came back. So it was that she heard sounds. Oh, something like little kids playing with the icicles that were running down the house. And she saw a figure stepping from behind a tree, and he said, I am the king of winter, and I bring the cold. Well, you bring too much of it. My feet are getting frozen out here. And besides, I should be inside by a warm fire, but my mother's had me come out here because you gave my stepsister gifts yesterday. he stepped out from behind another tree that he was decorating with icicles and ice. And he said, I am the king of winter, and I bring the ice and snow. Well, that's all right, but have you ever thought about how people can slip on the ice or fall into the snow? That's really uncomfortable when that happens. The king of winter stepped from behind a tree for a third time and said, I am the king of winter, and I bring you a gift. Well, the next morning when the peasant went out to bring back the stepdaughter, then he brought her back, and the stepmother of Alexandra, could see in the distance the sparkling white where her daughter sat in the sleigh next to the peasant. And she was so thrilled because she was sure that her daughter was going to be rich, and that would be a great way to get her a good husband, one who wouldn't mind her other habits. But as the sleigh pulled up by the house, she recoiled in horror. For what had seemed like diamonds in the distance were crystals of ice covering her daughter. And what had seemed like the beautiful white fur coat that Alexandra had gotten was snow encrusted on her daughter's body. And perhaps there's evidence that she did have a heart in her after all, because it broke at that point, and she fell to the ground and perished herself. Now, it is said that from that point on, Alexandra was the one who ran the farm, but it is also said that she had a husband that no one ever saw most of the year. Someone who seemed to be wealthy and seemed to make her very happy. And if Alexandra never mentioned that he spent the winter at his own work, well, you know how these things go. But Alexandra and the peasants that she managed more wisely and more kindly lived happily ever after. And that's the tale of the Winter King.
Nick?
Yes.
Okay, I'll take the spotlight off you. And I think we didn't have anybody else join, so.
Yeah, I thought Adrian was going to be here tonight.
Yeah, she emailed me and said that she couldn't make it, unfortunately.